So this is another in our regular series looking at the greatest playoff periods for the Montreal Canadiens. And this will be the first I'm looking at probably one of the best overtime periods in Montreal Canadiens history in the playoffs. Of course, we're talking about Game 7 of the divisional final, the quarterfinals in the 1986 NHL playoffs, where the contest in question played a huge factor in the Montreal Canadiens winning the Stanley Cup that year on the backs of a rookie goalie. We would call him King Roy or Patrick Roy. Now, the Hartford-Montreal series wasn't the most exciting set. If anything, Montreal and Hartford were two defensive stalwarts that year, and most people considered the winner of the series not say a pure Stanley Cup contender, but whoever was going to win Game 7 could have enough momentum into the next round. And sure enough, that's what happened. Now, Game 7 was a defensive battle from the start. Mike McPhee had scored in the first period to give Montreal a 1-0 lead. And this was after Game 6 where Montreal couldn't score a goal. So we're looking at almost two full games here where Montreal only scored one goal in regulation. Now, Montreal held the lead until almost late in the third period with the very underrated Dave Babbage, who was on the tail end of a bad playoff, scored his only goal of the playoffs that year on a feed from Dean Evison with a little bit less than 3 minutes to go. Now, Montreal was having trouble with Mike Louis the whole game, and a lot of media that were covering that contest before the overtime said Montreal is going to have to get a few more offensive chances to secure the victory. Now, the overtime lasted less than 6 minutes, but for the majority of the extra frame, Montreal, not say were dominant, but were getting the best chances. But with about a little bit after the 5:30 mark, Claude Lemieux found himself in the Hartford zone fighting for the puck. He was eventually kind of knocked off balance, but continued to grind behind the net and got an opportunity to go in front. And when he went in front, I think it'd be best called a scoop shot. He basically came around. Louis gave him a little bit of the opposite corner, and sure enough, Lemieux, who had a great playoff that year, scored a counter that won Montreal the series and eventually allowed them to get the momentum to win the Stanley Cup. Now, the goal call is all over YouTube, especially the SRC announcers. Probably the most excited I've ever heard, CBC French's announcers for a counter. And this ranks as probably one of the biggest overtime goals of all time because of what it meant to the franchise who have not won a Stanley Cup in 7 years. All the the negative results of the early 80s when the loss to the Stars, to the Oilers, to Quebec and Buffalo in successive years. 84 was a good run, but with Steve Penny, they only could go so far. They came within 2 games of the final. 85, they lost to the Nordiques in their divisional final. But here in 1986, because of the grinding style, like the trap, Montreal was playing the trap. Montreal was trying to win every game 2-1 or 1-0, and by any means necessary, no doubt. But Mike Louis, who had a very bad Canada Cup for Canada in the finals against Russia in 81, here I don't think he was weak on the goal, but just like Ken Dryden before him, he would have mental lapses in front of his crease, and this was one of them. But to see the work Lemieux took to score this goal, only maybe Claude Lemieux could have scored on such a play because there was no real, glory to it or a great passing play. It was just basically a guy probably bowling towards the net. I really think that Claude Lemieux drew a lot of the energy that hated the Montreal Canadiens on himself, and he pointed inwardly and did the best results he could. But every goal he scored in that playoff was bigger than the last, and this, of course, was one of the biggest overtime goals in Montreal Canadiens history and in NHL history. So this is a short podcast because I will try to make it about the same length of the overtime period. Please leave a like, a subscribe, or a comment. I really am pleased I could do these greatest periods in NHL history for the Montreal Canadiens, because I think they deserve recognition because they perfected the big period results throughout the years. Every Stanley Cup they ever won, it was based on probably one of the most solid periods in that year's playoff, or like a comfort behind victory that really stood out. I think I'm going to wrap it up around 6. This is number 5, because if you're a Toronto Maple Leaf fan listening to this podcast, you basically don't recognize the fact of these things occurring. According to you Maple Leaf fans, Montreal's great success in the playoffs deserves no respect. Well, we don't respect you either, because why would you take up for a loser for a team that used to play Ron Settlebauer at the power play? Have a good day. Bye.